Today, we're going to be talking about the international architecture of what I'm calling the early post-Cold War world. And by early, I'm really focusing on the time from the collapse of communism until the financial crisis of 2008, because we're going to see that ushered in pretty big structural changes in both in the within a lot of the countries we're going to be talking about, and in international political economy and in international relations. Our agenda: we're going to talk about NATO expansion after the Cold War. We're going to talk about the Washington Consensus, and then we're going to talk about the European Union, its enlargement and its challenges. So it's a pretty big menu. I do want to take a minute to say something about three lenses for thinking about politics. One of the problems with political science is that people tend not to say in words of one syllable what they can say in words of 5 syllables. And so there's an awful lot of terminology and jargon. And it's my ambition to use as little of this as possible. But I do want to alert you to 3 different ways of thinking about politics that to some extent compete and to some extent are complementary. The first is one that focuses on people's interests. You might think of Marxism as focusing on people's economic interests, but also formal rational choice models of politics that use economic approaches to politics focus on people's individual interests. It's all interest-based. And we think about just common folk wisdom about politics. People expect people to do things that are in their interest. When we move into the realm of international relations, this interest-based way of looking at the world sometimes traffics under the title of realism. That the realists in international relations are people who say that countries follow their individual interests. Now, not every interest-based theory of international politics is realist, because there are some who say, well, yeah, but you've got to look at the domestic politics of countries and how that influences what they do internationally. So they might still be interest-based, but they're not going to take countries as their basic unit of analysis. But the idea behind realism, behind all of these different schools I've just mentioned, is that if you want to understand what's going to happen in politics, look at the interests of the relevant actors. Might have different theories about that, but so on, interest-based. The second basic lens that people bring to bear on politics is about institutions. And here in domestic politics, it might be people who think independent courts and the separation of powers are important, that they structure what happens. Others think, no, it's the kinds of political parties, but institutional arrangements are important. When we think about the international system, so institutionalists travel under various labels again. They call them liberal institutionalists, some of them, but sometimes they just call themselves institutionalists, plain and simple. But they look at international institutions, things like the United Nations. NATO is a kind of institution. It's an alliance. It's not an international institution. It's an alliance, but it has an institutional presence. So this second lens focuses on institutional arrangements which may or may not be consistent with the way people's interests line up, right? So for instance, George Kennan, who I mentioned to you last time, thought the United Nations was a waste of time because countries always behave in their interests. And if the UN told them to do something that wasn't in their interest, they would ignore it. So that there you can see possible tensions between institutionalist and interest-based accounts. Rosa Luxemburg is famous for saying the rivers of history run through the most finely meshed statute. So again, it's a Marxist view that interests are going to prevail and institutional stuff is irrelevant. And then the third I'm putting under the heading of ideals. And this can be ideas, culture, norms, things other than interests and institutions that affect what actually happens in politics. And again, people disagree a lot about, some hard-boiled realists will say norms and institutions are all beside the point. Others think norms are very important and that they actually structure what happens. Again, here there's lots of fancy terminology to capture this notion. There's something called constructivism in international relations theory. It's basically a theory of normative behavior, norms shaping outcomes. And so a lot of the squabbling in the academic journals and so on is among people who focus on interests, on institutions, or on ideas. And my own view, just putting my cards on the table before we dig into today, is that to say which is the right one is the wrong question. And it's better to try and understand what are the conditions under which interests tend to prevail, or institutions tend to prevail, or norms can restructure things. And those conditions change. And there's often much more play. There's sometimes much more play for norms, say, than at other times, like when the Cold War collapses and the institutional architecture is up for grabs. Then it might matter a lot what ideas are out there or not out there. But in the middle of the Cold War, when everybody's locked into positions that are highly rigid, then ideas are probably largely going to be beside the point. So that's the way I will tend to use these notions, and you will see them coming up obviously today, but throughout the course. Okay, so let's think about the first post-Cold War international security crisis, which was prompted by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in late 1990.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed, its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined. This military action, taken in accord with United Nations resolutions and with the consent of the United States Congress, follows months of constant and virtually endless diplomatic activity on the part of the United Nations, the United States, and many, many other countries. Arab leaders sought what became known as an Arab solution, only to conclude that Saddam Hussein was unwilling to leave Kuwait. Others traveled to Baghdad in a variety of efforts to restore peace and justice. Our Secretary of State, James Baker, held an historic meeting in Geneva, only to be totally rebuffed. This past weekend, in a last-ditch effort, the Secretary General of the United Nations went to the Middle East with peace in his heart, his second such mission, and he came back from Baghdad with no progress at all in getting Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. Now, the 28 countries with forces in the Gulf area have exhausted all reasonable efforts to reach a peaceful resolution, have no choice but to drive Saddam from Kuwait by force. We will not fail. As I report to you, air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq. We are determined to knock out Saddam Hussein's nuclear bomb potential. We will also destroy his chemical weapons facilities. Our objectives are clear. Saddam Hussein's forces will leave Kuwait. The legitimate government of Kuwait will be restored to its rightful place, and Kuwait will once again be free. Iraq will eventually comply with all relevant United Nations resolutions, and then, when peace is restored, it is our hope that Iraq will live as a peaceful and cooperative member of the family of nations. I had hoped that when the United States Congress, in historic debate, took its resolute action, Saddam would realize he could not prevail and would move out of Kuwait in accord with the United Nations resolutions. He did not do that. Instead, he remained intransigent, certain that time was on his side. Saddam was warned over and over again to comply with the will of the United Nations, leave Kuwait or be driven out. Saddam has arrogantly rejected all warnings. Instead, he tried to make this a dispute between Iraq and the United States of America. Well, he failed. Tonight, 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa, and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. These countries had hoped the use of force could be avoided. Regrettably, we now believe that only force will make him leave.
So that was the first Gulf War, so-called Operation Desert Storm. As President Bush said there, it was authorized. This is Resolution 678, which I will post and you can peruse at your leisure. I do want to notice that, it was authorized by the Security Council with Cuba and Yemen voting against. They were temporary members of the Security Council. The way the Security Council works is any one of the 5 permanent members can veto it, and China chose to abstain, but it didn't veto it. And the Soviet Union supported it. So I start with this because I want to point out several things about what Bush did. He certainly was, the U.S. was certainly not blameless in this whole affair, and I don't want to sugarcoat every aspect of what President Bush did in this regard. He was heavily criticized later for having apparently signaled to Saddam Hussein that it would be okay with the U.S. if they went into Kuwait. He was also criticized for encouraging a Shiite uprising in southern Kuwait and then not supporting it after we left. So there are grounds for criticizing what we did, but the things I want to point out is, first of all, it was an action of last resort. Every effort, as he said in the video, had been made to end this without an invasion. Secondly, it was proportional. Stop the bully without becoming one. Bush took a lot of criticism for this. People said, you should go to Baghdad. You should knock off this regime. And he steadfastly refused to do it, partly because of the fact that he was not behaving unilaterally. As he indicated, there was a genuine coalition, including every Arab country except Jordan was actually participating in this. And he knew that if he did more than the UN mandate, the Security Council resolution mandated, the coalition would collapse. So it was a broad-based coalition with strong regional support to stop the bully without becoming a bully. That is to say, this aggression will not be tolerated. And this, as I said, was the first international security crisis of the post-Cold War world. And had that become the template going forward, we would be in a very different place today. Well, that's one of the things I'm going to be arguing to you later in the course, because as it turns out, it was one of the paths not taken to treat the way in which Saddam Hussein had been expelled from Kuwait as perhaps norm setting for the future handling of international security crises. It was a path not taken. Okay. Let's talk about NATO. What, when, and why? So NATO is a creature of the Cold War. And I've already mentioned the United Nations several times today, and it's important to think about NATO and the origins of NATO alongside the creation of the United Nations, because they were created both in the 1940s. After World War I, Woodrow Wilson had wanted to create a League of Nations, and that had failed largely because the American Congress wouldn't go along with it. And FDR had, during World War II, greatly invested in the idea that there must be an institution of this general sort created after World War II to prevent nations from going to war. And when President Truman came into office, he made it his business to make sure that that happened. And so here you can see President Truman addressing the conference in San Francisco in April of 1945 as they were drawing up the Charter of the UN.
There were many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, language and culture. But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war. If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die. Now there's a time for making plans, and there's a time for action. The time for action is here now.
And indeed, they did act, and they did create the institutions. And just to elaborate what he said later on in that speech, he said, "The essence of our problem here is to provide sensible machinery for the settlement of disputes among nations. Without this, peace cannot exist. We can no longer permit any nation or group of nations to attempt to settle their arguments with bombs and bayonets." So he was foursquare behind the creation, as the U.S. was, unlike after World War I, the creation of the United Nations. But time moves on, and 4 years later, we were looking at a very different reality.
For us, war is not inevitable. We do not believe that there are blind tides of history which sweep men one way or another. In our own time, we've seen brave men overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable and forces that seemed overwhelming. Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny. They can choose slavery or freedom, war or peace. I have no doubt which they will choose. The treaty we are signing here today is evidence of the path they will follow. If there is anything certain today, if there is anything inevitable in the future, it is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
So there was the creation of NATO, an alliance to face down what was seen as the Soviet threat. The previous month, just after the text of the proposed treaty had been released to the public, Secretary of State Dean Acheson went on radio, and I tried to, I was going to play his radio speech for you, but the sound was too bad. But here you can see him saying that the best deterrent to aggression is the certainty that immediate and effective countermeasures will be taken against those who violate the peace. And then probably the most quoted line he ever uttered was that if the free nations do not stand together, they will fall one by one. So here the U.S. had moved from backing an international institution for solving conflicts to forming an alliance. And just what was this alliance? The most famous part of the NATO Charter is Article 5, which says that the parties agree that an armed attack on one of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against all of them, and consequently, that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in the exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the UN Charter, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. And any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result thereof shall immediately be reported to the Security Council, and, this is an important kicker, such measures shall be terminated when the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to restore and maintain international peace and security. So here is an alliance created that says an attack on one is an attack on all. We are entitled to protect any member of that alliance as though we had been attacked. We will report it to the Security Council, but we will not cease and desist until the Security Council has taken the measures necessary, essentially, to eliminate the threat. So not only had the U.S. created this new alliance, but had clearly said that the UN, a realist might say this is exactly what you should expect. A realist would say that the UN is subordinate to the interests of NATO. Now, it tells you how hard-boiled a realist Kennan was, that he was also against NATO for two reasons. One is that he thought it would unnecessarily militarize the standoff with the Soviets. They would create a similar alliance, which they indeed did a few years later. That's where the Warsaw Pact came from. It was the Soviet response to NATO. But he also said it's stupid because when the chips are down, countries follow their own interests. They're no more going to be guided by membership of an alliance than they are going to be guided by UN resolutions. Nonetheless, the US created NATO. And the first thing to say about NATO is it's a historically unprecedented, highly unusual alliance. If you think about George Washington's farewell address to Congress in 1796, he said, and this was seen as a warning for the future, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world." If you Google up things like international encumbrances, you can find American president after American presidents saying we will not commit ourselves to any encumbrance on a long-term or permanent basis. They all echo this philosophy that was once attributed to Lord Palmerston from a famous speech he made in the House of Commons in 1846 when he said, "We have no eternal allies, we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests," another hard-boiled realist, "are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." So American presidents had been guided, American administrations had never formed any kind of permanent alliance that essentially followed the Palmerston-Washington view. And here we have the creation of an alliance among the Western powers dedicated to protecting one another in perpetuity, with armed force if necessary and subordinating international institutions to that purpose. Now, a lot of debate about whether NATO was successful during the Cold War. You could say, well, the US won the Cold War, and some people say, you could say that we wouldn't have won it without NATO. That's we can't run the counterfactual So it really is something of an imponderable whether we could have won the Cold War without NATO. It is also worth noticing that NATO, during the Cold War, never actually went into battle. The first time a NATO operation occurred, which I'm going to talk more about later in the course, was in Kosovo in 1999, after the Cold War over. And by the way, when Article 5 was not triggered because no NATO country was threatened. And that same thing is true with subsequent NATO actions in the post-Cold War period, such as the invasion of Libya in 2012, about which we'll also be spending time later. The partial exception was 9/11, although even then NATO, the US essentially went to war more or less immediately after the attacks, and NATO allies participated, but NATO didn't assume full operational control in Afghanistan until several years later. So NATO after the Cold War. Some people, such as French President Francois Mitterrand, said, well, it's done its job, we should get rid of it. It was there to protect these countries against the Soviet Union, and it's now an alliance without a purpose. That was a difficult thing to do right at the end of the Cold War because of East Germany. And the thing about East Germany was it rapidly became clear after the wall came down that Germany was going to be reunited. And it was an unstoppable force to reunite Germany. And reuniting Germany made a lot of people nervous. There were many people remembered World War II, and some, not that few, also remembered World War I. And the idea of an independent Germany outside of NATO made a lot of Europeans nervous. And so the impetus to say the reunified Germany would be part of NATO came from the other European powers. And the Russians didn't like it. They too said, you know, what's going on here? Why is NATO starting to expand? And George Herbert Walker Bush and Helmut Kohl, who was then the German chancellor, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand beyond, including Germany, and that had been an artifact of the reunification. Gorbachev was less than impressed by their reasoning.
And I am not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about. You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences. So my question is this a new strategy? I feel that if the same kind of games continue to be played, if one country plays some card against the other country, then all of those problems, all of those issues that we've been mentioning today will be very difficult to resolve. Glasnost, free elections, political pluralism, the problems of concern to you.
So he was skeptical. He thought that this is not likely to be how things are going to play out. But he saw this, as he says in that clip, he saw this as a humiliation of Russia. Or it was still the Soviet Union at that time. He saw this as a humiliation of the Soviet Union, and was adamantly opposed to it. But history played out differently. So let me just give you a sense of what was coming now.
Today we welcome Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, finally erasing the boundary line the Cold War artificially imposed on the continent of Europe, strengthening an alliance that now clearly is better preserved to keep the peace and preserve our security into the 21st century. For the 16 of us already in NATO, enlarging our alliance, our goal is to help to build a Europe that is undivided, free, democratic, at peace, and secure.
So there you have it, the first three East European countries included in NATO in 1999. And that, as you can see, is the first edition of countries, besides Germany's not on this list, since the end of the Cold War. So this didn't go down very well in Russia. As Gorbachev had predicted, it produced a sense of outrage and humiliation. So here, again, just to give you a little flavor of it.
Самое главное, чтобы натовцы поняли, что есть поколение, которое исправит ошибки сегодняшних политиков. Это поколение вот стоит.
So a couple of comments about that clip. So one is on the signs. One of the things that they're demonstrating about is that President Clinton had bombed Iraq for violating the no-fly zones. And they say basically only an idiot or worse would be bombing Iraq, the no-fly zones that had been set up following Saddam Hussein's invasion from Kuwait. This gentleman at the end of the clip is somebody by the name of Sergei Baburin. He was a Soviet-Russian politician and subsequently became one of the leaders of a far-right populist movement. And what he's saying at the end of that clip is he's basically saying, we made a mistake once, but the next generation are not going to be making the same mistakes. And it's interesting that he said this in response to them demonstrating against the American bombing of Iraq. Partly because, as I noticed in 1991 when I was in Moscow, and I was told you about in an earlier lecture, the U.S. Desert Storm operation was hugely popular among Russians in 1991. In 1991, the U.S. could do no wrong. In fact, in Moscow in 1991, in March of 1991, there were actually commercials for selling Desert Storm condoms. Go figure. I never quite could understand what it was trying to communicate, but there had been no resistance to the idea that Bush Sr. had gone in. But 7 years later, when these East European countries were starting to join NATO, things played out very differently. And it didn't stop there. It continued.
Thank you all. Welcome. Thank you all. Thank you all. Good afternoon and welcome to the White House. Today we proudly welcome Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. We welcome them into the ranks of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. When NATO was founded, the people of these 7 nations were captives to an empire. They endured bitter tyranny. They struggled for independence. They earned their freedom through courage and perseverance. And today they stand with us as full and equal partners in this great alliance. This is a special moment in the hopeful story of human liberty, as America formally declares its support for Albania and Croatia's entry into NATO. We strengthen America's partnership with nations that once found themselves in the shackles of communism. We rejoice in taking a major step toward welcoming the people of Albania and Croatia into the greatest alliance for freedom the world has ever known.
And I want to reaffirm as strongly as I can the United States' commitment to honor Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. No ally or adversary should ever question our determination on this point. It is the bedrock of the alliance and an obligation that time will not erode. The NATO membership process, which requires applicants to make reforms across their political, economic, and defense sectors, has helped create the stable, democratic Europe we see today. We were glad to see the alliance welcome Albania and Croatia last year, and there can be no question that NATO will continue to keep its door open to new members.
Montenegro's accession is good for Montenegro, it's good for NATO, it's good for the stability of the Western Balkans, and it's good for international peace and security. Today is a historic day, so President Vujonovic, welcome so much to NATO. It's a great honor to have you here. Welcome.
With NATO membership, our future will be stable, secure, and prosperous, and we will make decisions about the most important issues within the strongest, the most organized and most efficient alliance in the history of mankind.
So, as you can see, this has been a bipartisan story on the U.S. side. Democrats and Republicans alike have led the expansion of NATO to include all of the former members of the Warsaw Pact except for Russia. And this actually doesn't tell the whole story, because there were others who wanted to join NATO as well. So in 2008, for example, NATO announced that it would welcome the addition of Georgia and Ukraine to NATO. And that is part of what prompted the Russian incursion into Georgia in 2008, and also had a big impact in Ukrainian politics that contributed to the way things would play out in 2014. A couple of other things to notice about this accession. You might wonder why in 2004 we added all of these countries to NATO. Why do you think? Anyone have a thought? Why would the Bush administration, many East European countries wanted to join NATO from very early on, but there had been resistance. I mean, after all, you know, you're committing yourself to go to war if one of these countries is attacked. That's not a light thing, right? You actually, it's not like saying, well, let them join the European Union. If they don't like it, we'll kick them out, or they can leave. This is really committing you to defend these countries. Why would the U.S., anyone, pardon? It was related to what he was doing in the Middle East, but it was not deflection. What had we were we doing? What had we just done in the Middle East in 2004? Yeah.
We had just invaded Iraq, and then the former, current NATO allies were not supportive and potentially.
Bingo. Exactly right. So what had happened was after. And this is something we will return to later in the course, but once the Bush Jr., George W. Bush, had decided to invade Iraq in 2003, unlike what his father had done, he couldn't get a Security Council resolution to authorize it, and he had a lot of trouble putting together a coalition because all the Middle Eastern countries were not in favor of it. And he needed the fig leaf of an international coalition to create, he thought, legitimacy for this action. And so if you look at all of these countries except Slovenia, every one of these countries joined the coalition, nominally at least, and sent troops to Iraq as part of the U.S.-led coalition of the willing. They joined the coalition of the willing, and the quid for the quo was that he supported their accession to NATO the following year. Interestingly, though, they all got rid of the draft in the meantime. Clearly, they were worried about the domestic politics of committing their youth to fighting in wars to defend NATO countries. So here you see that geopolitics playing itself out in this way, that this is very much an interest-based story, that Bush is looking to get legitimation for his invasion, and so that became the impetus for getting these countries to join. It's also, one might think it's something of an anomaly given the Trump administration's hostility to NATO in general, why they allowed the Montenegro thing to go forward. Of course, it had been started much earlier, but I think as far as Trump is concerned, it doesn't really matter who's in NATO. Nonetheless, the question that Trump asks about NATO is not a crazy question, right? And it's the same question Francois Mitterrand was asking. What is this alliance there actually for? So there's some enduring questions about post-Cold War NATO, which are going to come back later in the course. One is, was Mitterrand right? Was there a missed opportunity at the end of the Cold War? Was Gorbachev right? Did NATO expansion make it more likely that someone like Putin would come to power in Russia? Gorbachev had said, humiliate people and there will be consequences. And certainly the steady incursion of NATO into the former, not only Eastern Europe, but as I said, they were running up trial balloons about incorporating the Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. There's a colorable case that this might have bolstered the nationalism of a figure like Putin. We'll come back to that too. And what are the advantages and costs of having a permanent military alliance that now lacks any clear motivating purpose? It's led by the most powerful military on earth. It's not clear what its goal is or is not. We will see later in the course that when it has become active, it has had nothing to do with Article 5 of the NATO treaty, but it's rather taken on new missions and new rationales, mostly ad hoc, dreamed up on the fly to suit the interests of different players at different times. Let's turn to the Washington Consensus, or what I'll say, taking neoliberalism global. And I'll talk somewhat briefly about this because I want to spend most of the rest of the time talking about the European Union. So the Washington Consensus, again, and what I call the Washington Consensus is essentially a global version of what often gets called neoliberalism. And I think of it, again, distilling it down and getting rid of all the jargon that plagues these discussions as having three main features. One is deregulation, the second is free trade or trade agreements, and the third is privatization of state assets, previously held state-held assets. Within countries, that tends to be called neoliberalism. When the World Bank or the IMF or the Americans try to get other countries, as they did particularly up until the financial crisis, when the Washington Consensus, we'll see, started to lose some of its ideological power in the world, that's what the core elements of the diet on which they would insist for countries to get U.S. aid or aid from institutions controlled by the World Bank or the IMF. And it's difficult to overstate the confidence, the hubris, we might say in retrospect, the confidence with which this was viewed as the one-size-fits-all approach to economic development. In 2004, in a speech to the New York Fed, I think it was to the New York Fed, Ben Bernanke, who was then chairman of the Federal Reserve, made a speech that you can, if you Google up his Great Moderation so-called speech, it's a speech in which he says, essentially, the technocrats running the Fed are now sufficiently competent that well, he didn't actually say this, but this is how what it's come to be interpreted as having said. What he actually said was somewhat more nuanced. But the takeaway lines from the speech are to the effect that the Fed has basically managed to, if not abolish the business cycle, manage it so successfully that the peaks and troughs cannot be too damaging, and we can largely have no inflation, full employment, and let the technocrats run it. As I said, what he actually said, if you go and read the whole speech, was a little more nuanced than that. But it became emblematic of the idea that this diet of economic deregulation, free trade, and privatization informing all public policy was the way to go, and that the world would be hunky-dory thereafter. Deregulation of Wall Street after the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999. So here, the Glass-Steagall Act had been enacted in the 1930s in the wake of the Depression to stop trading, to stop investment banks from engaging in investments on their own accounts with depositors' money. You either had to be an investment bank or a commercial bank. The banks didn't like it. They lobbied against it for decades, and actually by the time it was repealed in 1999, there wasn't much of it left. Read Ron Chernow's The House of Morgan if you want the blow-by-blow of the lobbying about that. Brilliant book, among his many brilliant books. And so there's great debate now about how much actually getting rid of Glass-Steagall contributed to the financial crisis. Some say not at all. Some say it was really all about real estate markets, had nothing to do with that, and some say a lot. But my point in mentioning it here is not whether repealing Glass-Steagall contributed to the financial crisis. I tend to think probably not. but it was emblematic of and ushered in a whole other set of steps of deregulation. So for instance, in 2004, Hank Paulson, who was then chairman of Goldman Sachs, led a group of the 5 biggest banks to Washington to lobby Christopher Cox, who was then the head of the SEC, not the sharpest knife in Congress, to lobby him on the grounds that if a bank was sufficiently big, if it had $5 billion in assets, it should be exempted from capital requirements or have reduced capital requirements because they were big enough to self-insure. The thought that because they were so big is maybe why they should have the capital requirements didn't seem to occur to him. So the ones that were too big to fail were the ones that were subjected to less in a way of capital requirements. And we might say, go figure, how could anybody be so foolish? The quid for the quo, by the way, they said, we'll open our books to you. But the SEC at that time had a tiny office with, I think it was 7 people working in it, ostensibly to keep track of $4 trillion worth of assets. So they weren't going to be able to do this in any serious way, monitor the books of these companies. And indeed, months before the financial crisis, literally 2 or 3 months before the financial crisis, Cox was reassuring Congress that the big banks were fundamentally sound, and then turned around and Lehman Brothers went belly up. So, I'm not giving you a story about the causes of the financial crisis, but I'm giving you a story about the confidence people had in this deregulatory enterprise, that just leave it all to the Fed, get rid of all the regulations, and everything will be fine. And so this was the neoliberal game at home, and it was the Washington Consensus taken abroad. There was much more resistance to it in what we might think of as the global South. This is just one of endless numbers of cartoons one could put up, indicating that it was perceived as a kind of imperialist venture from the point of view of particularly developing countries that were having this diet imposed upon them. But in the second and first worlds, the hegemony of this idea was, it's hard to overstate. And I was talking about Russia last time. If you look at U.S. aid to Russia, it gives you some sense also, I think, as a kind of proxy for American influence over Russia. You can see that at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 92, 93, that you get huge amounts of U.S. assistance to Russia. And then it goes down, and then in 1998, when they default, this is when Russia defaulted on its debt, I talked about that last time, and gets bailed out by the IMF, you see it increase again. And then in the early 2000s, it goes down after the crisis wanes. And then here, and this is the period when Putin is basically implementing the Washington Consensus diet. This is when he's reforming the tax system. It's when he's bringing tax rates down to 13% flat rate, balancing the books, building up a massive sovereign wealth fund, a rainy day fund. And so he's essentially getting rewarded for following what many would have regarded as pretty orthodox Washington Consensus policies. And the best book about this is by a man by the name of Christopher Miller, which I put on the suggested reading list, called Putinomics. But then you can see, and this is for later in the course, what happens after the financial crisis. Not only does U.S. aid go south, but so does U.S. influence. And we'll talk more about that later. So let's talk about the European Union and its challenges. It's been around since early 1950s. The European coal and steel community came into being as a byproduct of the Treaty of Paris, signed by the original six: France, Italy, the Netherlands, West Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg. It became the European Economic Community as a result of the Rome Treaty of 1957. A much more ambitious treaty was enacted in 1992, the so-called Maastricht Treaty, and the most recent piece of legal architecture, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, was the Lisbon Treaty of 2007. I'm not going to give you the blow-by-blow of how all the 28 countries, how they got from 6 to 28, but you can Google it up for yourself and see when the different ones joined. What I want us to do is focus more on what was the point of this? Why was a European Union thought to be necessary? What purpose would it serve? Yeah. To stave off war. So in the first, there were multiple motives, but it's good that you're clairvoyant and got the first item on my slide, because what if you had come up with a third item on my slide? I would have been crossed out. But you came up with the first item, so that's fantastic. So part of the impetus was particularly people were worried about France and Germany going to war again. Not only the French and the Germans, Churchill, for example, was a big fan of the European coal and steel community, and he didn't want Britain to join, but he wanted the Europeans to join, partly for that reason. So that was a beginning, part of the initial impetus. This is, for the political philosophers in the room, this is Montesquieu's idea of du commerce, that if you have commercial interchange with a country, it's going to be peace generating, right? So that was one. Other reasons why people might have favored the creation, yeah. To reduce the pressure from the Soviet Union and? Okay, so let's take the second. This was less about the Soviet Union and more about the US, because I want to keep you on my slide here. This was the big French motive. De Gaulle, for example, was a big proponent of the idea that what the Europeans needed to do was to band together to be a comparable force in the world to the US, right? Now, de Gaulle, I'm sure, as you all know, was a staunch nationalist, right? Staunch French nationalist. So he did not want a political union that could in any way erode French national sovereignty. He would be, I think, chuckling at the Brexit fight that's going on at the moment. But the way in which de Gaulle thought you could both have a strong united Europe and protect the national sovereignty of France, which they got it very jealously. They kicked NATO troops out of France. They want their own independent nuclear deterrent. They did not. They had a very jealous conception of their independence and sovereignty, and they were not going to be pushed around by the Americans. So they came up with the idea that any important changes in the Union would have to be resolved by unanimity rule. And of course, unanimity rule is a dictatorship of one, right? If you have unanimity rule, if you don't like the proposed change, you can stop it, you can block it. So de Gaulle was a strong proponent of unanimity rule. And so this was the idea of a big bloc that could be of comparable economic clout in the world to the US. Any other reasons why people might have thought it important to have a big economic union of countries, European countries? Trade. You guys are amazing. Wow, wow, okay. Yes, so, but here's the thing, it's complicated because it's, and this is part of, again, Trump administration's beef about the EU. It's an internal free trade zone, but it's externally protectionist, right, in many respects. You go and talk to African farmers about the tariffs that they experience trying to sell their goods in Europe. So so in this sense, and this is one of the reasons Britain had such a difficult time before Britain finally joined under Edward Heath in the 1970s. They had been rejected twice because Britain wanted to preserve its imperial preference before they realized there was no empire left to prefer. But they had essentially had, they had had trading arrangements with members of the empire, and then when they created the Commonwealth, they still created, they wanted to have preferential treatment for trade from the Commonwealth, and the European Union said no, they couldn't have that. And so the French actually, de Gaulle was flatly against Britain joining the European Union and vetoed it, and they didn't join it until after he left power in 1969. So it was an internally free trade, but externally it was a protectionist trading bloc. And that, incidentally, is, we can fast forward, it's the story of TPP. What the Trump administration failed to understand, or at least to articulate, if they did understand it, was that the TPP was not just a free trade deal. It was about containing China from developing its influence in the Far East, and it was largely motivated actually by a political agenda because China, for reasons we're going to talk about later, had become much more muscular in the South China Sea and elsewhere during the course of the Obama administration. So the EU, we could say, is internal free trade zone, externally protectionist. But actually that's too simple, because the sense in which it was internally a free trade area is complicated, because as I put up here, was a first mover advantage. And so if you think back to what I just said about de Gaulle insisting on unanimity rule, that meant that the things you could put in place early on would be very difficult to change because you would have a veto power. And so the French didn't agree to the British joining until they had put in the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policies. And particularly the common agricultural policy was massive protection for French farmers and was operated to the great disadvantage of British farmers. And so it was a free trade zone with a difference. And an interesting irony of history here is that when Britain joined the European Union in the 70s, the British parties were polar opposite of what they are today about Europe. At that time, the Labour Party was badly divided over Europe, and the Conservatives were largely in favor of Europe, because Europe, the Tories thought, would be an instrument for disempowering British unions and deregulating the economy and making it function more efficiently. Margaret Thatcher, a lot of people don't know this. Margaret Thatcher was one of Ted Heath's most aggressive lieutenants in getting Britain into the European Union. She only became a Eurosceptic later. Not only that, Later, in about halfway through her administration, Margaret Thatcher was the person who pushed the European Union toward qualified majority voting on things like reducing non-tariff barriers to trade, because she could see, before she did that, she had negotiated big rebates for Britain because of the unfairness of the common agricultural policy and so on. So Britain was getting rebates, but she wanted, in her privatizing agenda, which we're going to be concerned with in a couple of weeks from now, she wanted more what we call neoliberal policies. She wanted the reduction of non-tariff barriers to trade in Europe. It was completely obvious you couldn't get that with unanimity rule in the Union, because whoever stood to lose by getting rid of these barriers to trade would veto. So they went to qualified majority voting to make decisions in the European Union at the behest of Margaret Thatcher. So that's another reason that the European Union was created. There was this internal free trade zone, but with these wrinkles to it. A fourth reason, which is much less intuitively obvious, is that people saw this as a counterweight to some of the pressures of their own domestic politics. And I can give you a dramatic example of this that I ran into at a conference in Portugal about 3 years ago, when the rolling euro crisis was going on and the southern European countries were in extremis. And a left-wing German intellectual, sort of neo-Marxist by the name of Klaus Offer, stood up. This was in Portugal, and he gave a speech in which he said, you know, we Germans are really screwing you Southern Europeans. You should insist on being let out of the euro, because you know, we're just forcing, you should be able to devalue your currencies and re-equilibrate your economies to get yourselves out of this crisis, and you can't because of us nasty Germans. So he was, you know, he thought he would get huge applause. And this Portuguese politician, I don't speak Portuguese, she stood up and screamed at him. And evidently he understood enough Portuguese to get the sense that she was angry with him, but not what he was saying. So he said, I think you've misunderstood what I'm saying. And he said it again, and she screamed at him even more. So then we went for lunch, and I was with a bunch of economists and lawyers, and I said, what was that about? And the economists all said, well, the Portuguese government knows that but for these constraints, the Portuguese government would be printing money hand over fist and would have massive hyperinflation. And the lawyers all said, you don't seem to understand. Portugal has never been able to be a democracy outside of the European Union, right? So these people saw it actually, the fact that this was a constraint on Portugal was a good thing. And in a less dramatic fashion, even the Germans liked some of the constraints. And then finally, of course, there was the idea of a federal European state. This is the idea most famously associated with Jacques Delors of an ever closer union. It actually comes from a declaration in Stuttgart, signed in 1983, including by the British, by the way. The heads of state or government, on the basis of an awareness of a common destiny and the wish to affirm the European identity, confirm their commitment to progress toward an ever closer union among the peoples and member states of the community. So, 5 motivations there. What do they all share in common? What's common? I mean, it's a disparate list, but there's one thing in common. Yeah. They focus on Europe. What's another thing in common? Power in numbers. What's another thing? Okay. So they're all examples, they're all from above. They're an elite project, if you think about it. They are the views of what elites think should happen in Europe. And a symptom of that happens in 2005, when the Maastricht had created a constitution that was going to integrate Europe even more, much more ever closer union. And as you can see, France and the Netherlands held referendums in which it was voted down by the populations, the European Constitution that had come out of Maastricht. And that quickly led the Czechs, the Danes, the Irish, the Polish, the Portuguese, and the UK governments all to cancel their referendums. And actually the Lisbon Treaty is a step back from Maastricht, because Maastricht was really trying to create a federal state, and the Lisbon Treaty steps back to making it an intergovernment arrangement. Very much a top-down enterprise. And so the implications of this are one, and this is the chapter and verse of this, is in Tony Judd's book, Post-War, which he published in 2005. He died shortly thereafter, so he had already finished it before these referendums. But the basic message of that book about Europe is, look out when the first crisis hits, because there's no grassroots support for this institution. And what happened when the first crisis did hit, we'll talk about later, but the chapter and verse of that is in Adam Tooze's book, Crashed, which is mainly a book about the Eurozone crisis and why the European governments have been unable to resolve it. And again, it's to do with the fact that this was an elite project, although he plays out the conflicts of interest within the elites. And then there's one final thing I will mention before we close, and to bring why have I've been talking about NATO and the European Union. So NATO is actually a source of the obstacle to a pan-European identity, because they contract out their national security. If you think back to the beginning of the US, we almost lost the War of Independence because the states wouldn't ante up soldiers and funds to fight the war. And the reason we created the federal constitution was to enable Washington to raise an army so that it could defend itself and pay its national debts. Because Europe contracts out essentially its national security to NATO, there's no European army. There's no sense that Europeans might have to go and die for Europe in the way that, as a result of the transition from the Confederation to the United States of America, we have created a national entity with which people actually identify. So there's an irony there that actually the strength of NATO can be an obstacle to the formation of a pan-European identity. Okay, we're out of time, and next we will be talking about fusing capitalist economics with communist politics in China and Vietnam.